Crisis of Islamic Civilization by Ali A. Alawi. Chapter 4 Disenchanting the World. Secularism's Trap. Into this unpromising environment, there emerged the figure of Sayyid Naqib al-Atas, a philosopher and educationalist of genius and profound insight, the closest thing to a polymath that modern Islam had produced. Sayyid Muhammad Naqib al-Atas was born in 1931 in Java into a family which traced its origins to the Arabs from the Hadratul Maut area of the Arabian Peninsula, who had migrated to the East Indies. His appellation, Sayyid, denotes direct descent from the lineage of the Prophet Muhammad through the Prophet's grandson, Hussein. His early instruction was in the Islamic sciences, Malay language, literature and culture. After school, Al-Atas joined the Malay regiment, which at the time was commanded by the British officers. He went on to Sandhurst, Britain's military academy, and was commissioned as an officer in 1955. However, Al-Atas was drawn to the metaphysics of the Sufis and his travels in North Africa and Spain, where he witnessed Islam's civilizational possibilities, left a deep impression on him. Resigning his commission, he continued with his philosophical studies. His thesis, completed in 1962, was a 2-volume work on the mysticism of Hamza Fansuri, a 16th century Sumatran Sufi. Al-Atas returned to Malaysia and held leading positions in the country's nascent university system. In 1987, he founded the postgraduate institute that would embody his teachings on the Islamization of knowledge, the International Institute of Islamic Thought and Civilization. Al-Atas created the concept of an Islamization of knowledge in 1978 in his work on Islam and secularism. He formulates his philosophy around key Islamic concepts whose essential meanings and functions have been grievously eroded by the elemental drive in modern Western civilization to eliminate the presence of the divine in the world. According to Al-Atas, the decay of Islamic civilization is mainly due to the displacement in Islam of the original meaning of knowledge by its mirror reflection. Now, this opposite of knowledge dominates the intellectual, political and social landscape of Islam. This ersatz knowledge dissolves Muslims' concern with ethics of conduct and devalues the significance of the primordial contract between God and man. Al-Atas talks about 2 types of knowledge: the rational, which derives from experience, and the knowledge of God, which lies in the heart of Islam. While the West uses knowledge to produce good citizens, second-order knowledge, the pursuit of knowledge in Islam aims to produce good human being, first-order knowledge. Knowledge of the first order leads to certainty and truth. Knowledge of the second order leads to a temporary truths and meshes man in the labyrinth of endless and purposeless seeking. First order knowledge allows people to repose and constancy, while the second type of knowledge leads to continuous doubt and the possibility of perpetual wandering spurred by the intellectual deception and self-delusion. There is no room in Islam for the myth of Sisyphus, perpetually rolling on the stone up a hill only to see it roll down again. Neither does Al-Atas acknowledge the existence of tragedy and drama in human condition. These are necessarily derived from the view of a man that sees in him the inability ever to arrive at a condition of steadfastness and serenity. In Islam, these values are guaranteed for a person who acts out his or her part of the divine covenant. According to Al-Atas, secularism is the West's retort to the existence of a divinely ordered world. The Harvard theologian Harvey Cox defined secularism as the loosening of the world from religious and quasi-religious understandings of itself, the dispelling of all closed worldviews, and the breaking of all supernatural myths and sacred symbols. When this condition commences, it is almost impossible to reverse. Presumably, the same dynamics would apply to Islamic societies who may, Canuet-like, try to stop the march of history but in the end be overwhelmed by it. Secularism thus becomes a process which, although originating in specifically Western context of the conflict between church and state, assumes the dimension of a universal force under which all sacral systems are bound to perish. It is an inevitable stage in the unfolding of the evolution of humanity from infantility to maturity. It removes the props which religion provides for humankind, and it forces the latter to fall on its own resources in ordering and confronting life's challenges. In some ways, this process cannot be denied. The entire inheritance of the Judeo-Christian tradition seemed to end up in the secular state, which, in as much as the march of the West is equated with the triumph of the West, will ensure its own transference ultimately onto non-Western societies. However, Al-Attas rejected the idea of secularism as a stage in the development of Islamic societies. In fact, he goes one step further, stating that all true religions would reject the idea that the divine should be banished from the public sphere. Christianity in the West is in fact an aberration of the original Eastern Church. It is an uncomfortable amalgam of Hellenistic Roman traditions fused with Judaic religious structures. Secularism is not embedded in the true biblical faith, at least not by recourse to the saying of "render unto Caesar what is Caesar's." In fact, Muslims do recognize the veracity of Christianity, but not necessarily in the Western version. Thus, the evolution of Western societies do not reflect the evolution of Christianity as such, or at least of Christianity which is acknowledged in the Quran as being an original and authentic faith. But Islam cannot and should not follow in the path of the West and prostrate itself to secularism, as this process is entirely related to the unique historical experience of the West. Historicity cannot be part of the reality of Islam. Islam is a revealed religion which has a set of necessary obligations to impose on all its adherents. These includes knowledge of the self and therefore of God. This is a key element in Al-Attas's conception of the primary form of knowledge. Such knowledge does not evolve or change. Islam's system of values are non-temporal and cannot be deconsecrated or subjected to relativism. Neither should Islam be taken in by the arguments of the West's philosophers, scientists, economists, sociologists, psychologists, and the like, who by their very nature deal in doubt, uncertainty, skepticism, and conjecture. Their views are bound to change, and with them, today's preoccupations become tomorrow's memory. Al-Attas was writing this in the late 1970s when the issue of religion and the Republic arena appeared to have been definitely settled. The Iranian Revolution had not happened, and the explosive eruption of religion back into the Western imagination was a long way off. In the past 3 decades, the issues of secularism and Islam have moved center stage as the world seeks to uncover the religious basis of Islam's violent fringe. The thesis of previous times that Islam will inevitably bow to the winds of secular change, a discussion which was carried mainly in polite terms in the West, has now been superseded by the urgency to find a solution to the supposed proneness of Islamic religious culture to extremes of violence. It is all very reminiscent of John Buchanan's classic 1916 novel, Green Mantle, where the Foreign Office Mandarin tells the hero Islam is a fighting creed and the mullah still stands in the pulpit with the Quran in one hand and a drawn sword in the other, supposing there is some Ark of the Covenant which will madden the remotest Muslim peasant with dreams of paradise. What then, my friend? Nearly a century later, the same message is emanating, if not from Whitehall, then from the right-wing think tanks in Washington and from bloggers on the World Wide Web. The secular makeup of Islam has virtually become a national security issue for the US and increasingly for Europe, as both are anxious about the supposed dangers of clash of civilizations or the presence of a large Muslim minorities in their midst. The word secular itself, which had almost lost its significance and resonance in the Western world, has been revived as capturing one of the defining characteristics of the Western civilization. Indeed, of all modern civilizations, secularism has been elevated to a precondition for having the whole range of human and civil rights that Western society is proud of. In particular, the freedom of expression and the rights of women have been made contingent on the existence of a secular culture and society. They cannot flower if society is overly concerned with the rights of religious beliefs. Religion comes to be then reduced to a privately held belief system which should in no way be afforded any special protection or privilege. If Islam as a total system of beliefs cannot be secularized, then the next best solution is to find a means by which Islam can be made to step aside from the public arena while the state and, if possible, society are secularized. Finally, when secularism has established itself as a doctrine of the state and belongs in the self-description of the ruling groups, as in Turkey or Tunisia, Islam should not be allowed back into the political arena without ironclad assurances that it would not repeal or dilute secularizing measures. Secularists, whether self-proclaimed or genuine, in Muslim lands and communities have received a new boost to their cause as they hitch themselves to this heightened Western concern for the direction of Islamic societies. Balancing thoughts and deeds. Fatalism has always been one of the characteristics of Islam, at least until quite recently. The ability of the poor peasant or the urban worker to put up with incredible hardships or privations was glibly attributed to the fatalistic streak in Islam, which is supposed to derive from Islam's exclusive concern with ethereal knowledge. The image of the happy Egyptian peasant or of the Pakistani street sweeper who accept their lot in life without protest or qualms, lingers in the mind as one of the side effects of a belief in an unalterable predestination. But this is patent nonsense. Islam is founded on the knowledge of the unseen that is given through inspiration or acquired by God's permission. Islam insists that it is this hierarchy at whose apex is the knowledge emanating from God that should be understood and respected. Man, therefore, would not be cut off from the source of knowledge by focusing his effort on a secondary form of knowledge, which can turn to self-deification. The journey of each human being has a destiny and end, from pre-existence to existence in time and then to death, then to another passage, namely into the post-existence. The ordering of the world is related to this certainty, and the presence of human beings in time and space must be balanced alongside it. If secularism is understood as concern but not over concern for the life of this world, then Islam recognizes its role in the balanced society, all the while affirming the reality and priority of a higher form of knowledge. Al-Attas makes a crucial distinction in this regard. Secularism, as commonly understood, is an exclusive concern for here and now and a denial of the validity of other worldviews in ordering the affairs of mankind. Islam does not demean contemplation or reflection on the wonders of nature, but it does claim that man should marvel not at nature, but at the signs of God which are manifested in nature. Thus, denying the reality of the orders of nature is in some ways an affront to God, but man's discoveries of the mysteries of creation are only further means to perceive the unseen. Modern secularization is a form of war against God. Its end product is the diminishing of human beings by decoupling their life from purpose and direction. Nature is robbed of its magic values and deconsecrated and public life is desacralized. Metaphysical Sufism has influenced a number of important Islamic thinkers, including Al-Attas. It has driven the reformulation of classical Islamic terms for a modern audience, but without the loss of an essential spirituality and without straying far from its commitment to an Islamic Sharia. It provides a formidable challenge both to Salafi Islam with its concern for power and outer rules of conduct, and to liberal Islam with its focus on the rights and freedoms, which has almost become a branch of Western intellectual tradition. Metaphysical Sufism is a masterful synthesis of philosophy and theology. The resultant body of knowledge, frequently called hikmah or wisdom, provides for its adherents an appropriate access to understanding the ways of God. The starting point is perfected model from which mankind devolves rather than evolves. The notion that human beings evolve from a lower to a higher state of knowledge, from a lower to a higher organism, simply does not arise in the framework of metaphysical Sufism. It is not that biological evolution in Darwinism's sense does not take place. Islam is not a literalist religion in this regard. It is rather that man aspires to a higher model of being whose contours have been already determined. The process of this arc of ascent, as it were, passes through several fields, including a perfection of the qualities of moral worth. The moral elevation of mankind is unrelated to the biological process. Its template has already been set before eternity, and man is pre-programmed to seek this end state. The more human beings align themselves to this primordial condition, the more they will realize their essential humanity. This goes beyond the virtues that are specifically generated through a moral philosophy anchored in human reasoning. True Muslims must therefore cultivate as a vital ingredient a religious sensibility based on Quran and on the prophetic example. This sensibility, which can discern limits, boundaries, and purposes of moral conduct, is acquired through a process which Al-Attas calls ta'addub, the knowledge of the appropriate moral action, a term derived from the root word adab, which can also mean courtesy. Thus, ta'addub goes beyond the normally understood meaning of educating people. The Muslim community cannot begin to approach the elements of essential knowledge if they have not been trained to exhibit the right courtesy towards this knowledge. Each aspect of this courtesy must be appropriate. Thus, adab to the self is to know the components of the self, from the animal, rational, and inspired components to the serene self. Adab to family, to friends, to community, to society, to leaders must also reflect the essential aspects of appropriateness of intentions, of behavior, and of action. Adab to language and literature is to place words in their proper context and to set them in an order that produces intelligibility and creativity. The malice of Muslim society is the degradation of adab, understood in terms of appropriate action in an appropriate setting. And this deplorable condition is directly attributable to the corruption or abandonment of authentic knowledge in favor of the secondary variety. Because of the intellectual anarchy that characterizes this situation, the common people have become determiners of intellectual decisions and are raised to the level of authority on matters of knowledge. Authentic definitions have become undone, and in their stead, we are left with platitudes and vague slogans disguised as profound concepts, wrote Al-Attas in his Prolegomena to the Metaphysics of Islam. The idea of Islamic University. In 1973, Al-Attas addressed a letter to the Organization of Islamic Conference Secretariat in which he set out the basic outlines of his critique of the state of knowledge among Muslims and formulated the need to found an authentically Islamic educational philosophy that would remedy this condition. In his letter, Al-Attas suggested the founding of a university which would be based on a conception of knowledge that was different from the Western universities. This new university would aim to produce the complete man or the universal man, a Muslim scholar who is universal in his outlook and is authoritative in several branches of related knowledge. Later, Al-Attas followed this up with a proposal for the formation of an Islamic university, which he presented to the First World Conference on Islamic Education, held in Makkah in 1977. A decade later, Al-Attas founded the International Institute of Islamic Thought and Civilization, ISTAC, in Kuala Lumpur to put his ideas into practice. The institute was formally opened in 1993 and moved into a complex of buildings designed by Al-Attas himself. The campus adhered to the classical symbols of Islamic art and architecture, from its orientation towards Mecca to the harmonious blending of its landscape and buildings with the natural environment. The institute evolved as a postgraduate university with a unique approach to the teaching of Islamic thought within the parameters of Al-Attas's philosophy. Its curriculum was based on the division of knowledge into the categories of the permanent and the changing. ISTAC eschewed the traditional division of the academy into courses and departments, building the curriculum around broad themes of Islamic thought, Islamic science, and Islamic civilization. It attracted a range of scholars and students and began to develop a worldwide reputation. ISTAC's settings on the outer rim of the Islamic world initially also worked to its advantage, as the institute was sheltered from the over-politicization of higher education of the Middle East, as well as from the bureaucracy and heavily handed security. ISTAC used English as the main medium of instruction without, of course, eliminating the necessary ground in the Arabic language. English was rapidly becoming an important language of expression for Islamic thinkers and intellectuals, and certainly it dominated in the academic and scholarly treatments of Islam. However, the entire experience was cut short when Al-Attas was summarily removed from his position of the founder director and forcibly made to retire in 2004. He and his institute became the victims of an ongoing war within the world of higher education in Malaysia and the wider Muslim world around the issue of meaning of the Islamization of knowledge and of the functions and purposes of an Islamic university. Al-Attas also fell foul of the petty jealousies and envies which prevail whenever a new and potentially revolutionary idea begins to take root. ISTAC was subjected to a barrage of criticism when it began to lose its official support. Al-Attas was seen as both eclectic and elitist. The public could not relate to ISTAC's scholarly output, and Al-Attas's attempt to engage the community through his weekly lectures floundered. Foremost among the Al-Attas's associates was one Muhammad Noor, an accomplished scholar in his own right and something of a Boswell to Al-Attas. But neither he nor the others could make the Attasization system intelligible to the wider public. Al-Attas's work was frequently portrayed as impenetrable and obscure. It never caught the wider imagination. Al-Attas himself achieved near iconic status in the rarefied academic world of metaphysical Sufism, with ISTAC receiving visiting scholars and dignitaries from all parts of the world. But his achievements proved insufficient when the decisive moment arrived. This occurred in 1998 when the Deputy Prime Minister of Malaysia, Anwar Ibrahim, lost out in a titanic power struggle with the Prime Minister Dr. Mahathir bin Mohamad. Anwar was subsequently tried and imprisoned. He had been a radical Islamist student in his younger days and a strong proponent of the idea of Islamizing knowledge. While serving as Minister of Culture and later Education in the early 1980s, Anwar had advocated the founding of specifically Islamic universities and lobbied the organization of the Islamic Conference to sponsor the idea of Islamizing knowledge officially. Anwar himself was an Islamic theoretician of sorts and had sponsored the founding of ISTAC. On his demise, the knives were out for Al Atas. He had no official champions left, and the widespread international calls for his reinstatement and the continuation of ISTAC's autonomous status fell on deaf ears. ISTAC was absorbed into the International Islamic University of Malaysia, a bastion of the alternative school of Islamizing knowledge that was diametrically opposed to Al-Atas's concern for the significance of primary knowledge and the nurturing of individuals who strive for moral clarity as a precondition for scholarly excellence. The alternative school was far more influential and better funded than that of Al-Atas's. It rose to prominence in the 1980s and was built around the person of Ismail Raji al-Faruqi, a Palestinian American academic who had studied at Al Azhar and a number of North American universities. His effort was backed by the financial might of Saudi Arabia and led to the establishment of a number of Islamic universities in several Muslim countries. The objectives were to Islamicize specific disciplines, especially in social sciences, to better serve the cause of Islam. An intricate and global network of intellectuals, academics, government officials, and wealthy patrons was interwoven by a Saudi backed, Virginia based thinking tank. The International Institute of Islamic Thought, which was initially headed by Al-Faruqi, became instrumental in organizing conferences and seminars around the world. Its aim was to push for the idea of Islamizing knowledge and to inaugurate universities which reflected an Islamist ideology tingled by Salafism. For a while, higher education policies in a number of important Muslim countries, such as Pakistan and Malaysia, were greatly influenced by the studies and position papers that IIIT developed. Leaders as disparate as Ziaul Haq in Pakistan and Mahathir bin Mohamad in Malaysia embraced the Islamization of knowledge primarily to bolster their Islamic credentials in increasing conservative and religiously observant society. However, in spite of the huge resources devoted to the propagation of this version of Islamization of knowledge, nothing of consequence emerged. It was far easier to discuss and argue about the theory of Islamizing disciplines than to address the practical issues of how to teach chemistry, for example, or how to structure a meaningful social science research project using Islamic value markers. The Islamization of Knowledge project has sputtered on into recent times with little of the former zeal and conviction. The Islamic universities which arose in the 1980s are far closer to the conventional models while they maintain the fiction that they are somehow different. IIIT itself had a brush with the US authorities in the post 9/11 world. The Virginia offices of one of its offshoots were raided in 2002 because of its links with suspicious Islamic charities, which were alleged to have funneled money to proscribed organization. Al-Faruqi, who was mostly associated in the public mind with the Islamization of knowledge thesis, met a tragic end. In 1986, he and his wife were found murdered by a man wielding a knife in their Pennsylvania home. The murders were never satisfactorily solved, and the suspicion remains that the killings were politically motivated. Al-Ghazali and Modern Times. The work of Al-Atas and others on Islamizing knowledge echoes that of Islam's greatest scholarly figure, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, who died in 1111. A great number of the reforming scholars and intellectuals of the modern times have tried to emulate the effect of Ghazali's magnum opus, the revivification of the sciences of religion, or the Ihya as it is popularly known, on the lives of Muslims and on the course of Islamic civilization. Ghazali is one of the few figures outside metaphysical Sufism who have crossed the divide between the theological worlds of the Sunni and Shia. Encyclopedic in scope, his work covers the entire gamut of religious life from the basics of worship and transactions to the prophetic model, the encouragement of an ethics of conduct based on the virtues, and finally a guarded acknowledgement of inspiration as a source of knowledge and the cultivation of an inner, even mystical spirituality. In early works, Ghazali also attacked the use of rational Hellenistic philosophy as a yardstick by which to gauge the veracity of religious faith. The exchange between Ghazali and his contemporary, the Andalusian jurist and philosopher Ibn Rushd, was settled at least in the Sunni Islamic world in favor of Ghazali. This fact was presumed to have sealed the fate of philosophical inquiry in Sunni Islam until the modern era. Islam became immune to rationalist discourse, or the claim ran. A version of this assertion is frequently made by critics of traditional Islam, from the neoconservatives to Muslim liberals, and constant repetition has turned it into a supposedly defining feature of Islam, which sets it apart from the West. Modern Islamic civilization cannot be revived if there is no philosophical inquiry, and we have to blame Ghazali for this unfortunate condition. The failure of Islamic civilization to produce modernity on its own is seemingly caused by Ghazali's hold on the subsequent Muslim life. The other current evolving in that period was the metaphysical Sufism associated with the person of Ibn al-Arabi, the possessor of one of the greatest mystical imaginations in history. Ibn al-Arabi's disciples carried this highly developed and aesthetic imagination into the Eastern Islamic lands, helping to create a culture of high Sufism which appealed not only to the Sunni world but through fusion with philosophy of Avicenna into the Shia world. This elitist, even solitary metaphysical Sufism stood apart from the intellectual currents of the time, but this did not stop it from being targeted as deviant and heretical by the radical Salafists, conservatives, and the clerical classes. How do Muslims think? The 1980s was a decade when consciously modern Islamic institutions and universities were being established, premised on the foundational principle of a unique Islamic knowledge. But in the same decade, in the western rim of the Islamic world, the Moroccan Muhammad Abid al-Jabri was developing an entirely different perspective on the problem of knowledge in Islam. Al-Jabri, probably the most significant Muslim thinker of the age who wrote in the medium of Arabic, challenged the idea of a single form of Islamic knowledge. His most important contribution to Islamic thought is the 3-volume work Naqd al-Aql al-Arabi, The Critique of the Arabic Mind, which, in spite of its title, deals mainly with the structure of Islamic knowledge. Al-Jabari argues that the formulation of the main outlines of Islamic knowledge did not happen during the prophetic period in the 7th century or soon after. Rather, it occurred as Islam settled over a vast empire and began to contend with developing systems of thought which could explain and contextualize its worldview. In early centuries of Islam, 3 distinct forms of Islamic knowledge evolved, each of them reflecting a particular way of interacting with the religion of Islam. The first was textually based, or al-Bayan as al-Jabari termed it, and relied on the study of the foundational texts of Islam and the biography, sayings, and actions of Prophet Muhammad. It drew on the Quran and on the prophetic narrations. These textual sources are authoritative by definition, so that no other form of knowledge can be used to alter decisions and rules derived from their proper textual analysis. The mechanisms by which such knowledge can be correctly drawn then become the appropriate field of inquiry. In this sense, Islamic knowledge of the Al-Bayan form involves a meticulous concern for the Arabic language and grammar in order to find or tease out correct inferences and to trace the development of theology, jurisprudence, and legal reasoning as the main components of Islamic knowledge. According to Al-Jabari, this form of reasoning had reached an end. There are only so many formulations which can emerge from using these particular tools of inquiry, and they had all been reached a few centuries after the founding of Islam. All that can be usefully said on the matter has already been said. In this form of knowledge, there is no room for natural or common law unless such laws submit themselves to the superior truth inherent in the proper understanding and reading of the Quran and the prophetic traditions. This is the type of reasoning which prevails among the Salafists and Wahhabists of the modern era. The second form of knowledge is one which Al-Jabari terms Al-Irfan, or the mystical knowledge, which derives from the spiritually inspired inner state or from person whose inspired state is unquestioned. This form of knowledge includes all the esoteric branches of Islam, Sufism and Shiaism, the philosophies of illumination and hikmah, wisdom philosophy, and branches of Islamic cosmology such as astrology, alchemy, and numerology. Al-Jabari repeats the claim that this form of knowledge originates in the Eastern mystical traditions which preceded Islam. It creates a universe of symbols and allusions, of hidden and manifest meanings, of higher and lower forms of knowledge. But its very nature, mystical knowledge, is not bound by any specific or invariant rules and can lead in an infinite number of directions. It feeds and informs the aesthetic and cultural sensibilities of Islam, but it has no or only little value in the management and ordering of worldly matters. Muslims who are prone to this type of thinking have basically retired their intellect, as Al-Jabari termed it. The third form of knowledge relates to or is derived from observation and empirical evidence, or al-burhan, literally proof. This knowledge is based on a causality and thus allows for the evolution of rationality anchored in natural laws. The weakness of Islam, according to Al-Jabari, is that although Al-Burhan knowledge was potentially capable of evolution into an Islamic form of modern rationality, its development was truncated. First, it was invariably held to be of secondary value compared to that of other two forms of knowledge. Its practitioners found themselves serving the other two types of knowledge and were inhibited when they contradicted the foundational texts of Islam. Secondly, this is crucial to understanding Al-Jabari's hypothesis: rational Islam was mainly an outcome of Western Islam, that is, the Islam of Andalusia and the Maghrib. Figures such as Ibn Rushd, Ibn Khaldun, and the theologian Al-Shatabi were the main proponents of an empirical and utilitarian Islam. The dichotomous division into a Western and an Eastern Islam is central to Al-Jabari's system. The full development of the rationalizing potential of Western Islam was blocked by the attacks on philosophy, on reason, and on uninspired human intellect carried by the generations of scholars, Sufis, and theologians. The Western tradition died out, leaving Islamic knowledge to be defined by its foundational texts and by its esoteric and mystical dimension. Reason became a tool for the further enhancement of the other two kinds of knowledge rather than being allowed to develop a separate and independent existence. The problem of Islamic thought, as Al-Jabari sees it, that it is caught in a vicious circle. The systems of knowledge which evolved were sufficiently self-reliant not to incorporate any significant external influences. Once rationality was assigned to a secondary and supportive role, empirical knowledge was devalued, and whatever achievements could be attributed to it were later subsumed within the European experience. The Europeans succeeded in transcending the limiting features of religious knowledge and built their civilization of science and technology on the back of a systematic break with the past. Empirical knowledge based on the observations, testing, and measuring became the gauge for interpreting and exploiting the natural world. Meanwhile, Islamic thought continues to revolve in knowledge system whose essential features have been fixed. The authority of the past becomes supreme and makes any departure from its authoritativeness appear suspect. Al-Jabari has called for a new rationality in Islam, drawing its inspiration partly from the abortive Western Islamic model and engaging Islam in a new dialogue with critical reason, empirical evidence, and utilitarian considerations. Al-Jabari's criticism of knowledge based simply on textual reasoning is valid, but using his criterion for the final purpose of knowledge. He fails to see the potential in the retired intellect of the mystical stream in Islam, which he contemptuously dismisses. He shares the common prejudices of both conservatives and modernists against the rejuvenating possibilities of spiritualized Islam. The various projects for rediscovering the source of true knowledge in Islam are an immense undertaking, creating greater than the capacities of any one individual, institution, or even lifetime. But it is a tribute to the pioneers of this movement that they have shown the courage to plant the first seeds, even though most of them have fallen on thorny ground. In many ways, Al-Ata's vision is the one which has met the challenges of time. Muslims have to go back to the first principles and rediscover the innate capacity to acknowledge the signs of gods in themselves and in the far horizons, a capacity which the Quran calls fitra, the original crack through which the divine light shines inside human beings. The premise is correct, is that this primary knowledge is the sine qua non for any subsequent development of a specifically Islamic civilization. Other systems of Islamizing knowledge refashion the outer world first, legally, politically, institutionally, methodologically, and leave the refashioning of the individual for later. In the final analysis, the Atasian vision of the Islamization of knowledge is a form of moral philosophy rooted in religious faith. It is focused on the recovery of the virtuous person as a precondition for the emergence of a moral order. It is also a philosophy of responsible freedom as the remoralized person conducts himself or herself freely within the parameters of appropriate action, or in Al-Ata's terms, with adab. However, the attempts to refashion the Islamic perspective faltered, being unable to quite shake off their academic pedigree or to disentangle themselves from governments and their educational bureaucracies. In the Islamic world, modern secular education has become too ensconced to be seriously challenged by international conferences on Islamizing knowledge and by impassioned speeches by scholars indignant about the decay of Islamic civilization. At the same time, the many Muslim governments which took up the cause of Islamizing knowledge did not see it as anything more than a tool designed to enhance their power and authority. As in most other waves of Islamic reform, the tide of Islamization of knowledge project crested and then retreated, leaving very few traces of its potential for promoting vital change in Islamic civilization. The decade of the 1980s thus ended not with the nurturing of Islam's creative forces, but with establishing the primacy of political Islam and its agendas. The defeat of the Soviet expedition in Afghanistan provided an enormous boost to the cause of militant Islamist forces worldwide. This coincided with the retreat of radical Shia Islam as Iran emerged from the almost decades-long Iran-Iraq war. Iran was exhausted and its revolutionary drive was now contained, if not fully eliminated.